In March 2020, early in the pandemic, a small group of people in Minnesota had an idea and saw an opportunity. These individuals believed that they could steal tens of millions of dollars from a federal child nutrition program by claiming to serve food to needy children when they were not. Their goal was to make as much money for themselves as they could while falsely claiming to feed children during the pandemic. As their plan met with initial success, they were joined by many others who also wanted to make money by falsely claiming to feed needy children. Before long, the scheme that began with a simple idea in March of 2020 grew to become the largest pandemic fraud in the United States. Good morning. My name is Andrew Luger, and I am the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota. With me today are FBI Special Agent in Charge Michael Paul, IRS Special Agent in Charge Justin Campbell, Inspector in Charge of the Postal Inspection Service Ruth Mendonsa, and Kevin Chambers, Associate Deputy Attorney General and Director of COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement for the Department of Justice. We are here to describe charges in what has become known in Minnesota as the Feeding Our Future fraud. Today we are announcing charges against 47 defendants in 6 indictments and 3 informations. The defendants are charged with federal crimes including conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and paying and receiving illegal kickbacks. In a moment, I will explain the fraud in detail. But as the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the state of Minnesota, let me say this up front. As alleged in these indictments, over a short period of time, these 47 defendants engaged in a brazen scheme of staggering proportions. As set forth in the indictments, this is a scheme that begins with Aimee Bock and Feeding Our Future. Feeding Our Future is at the core of this fraud, engineering a scheme that included many different groups of defendants as set forth in the 6 indictments that I will describe. The different groups on this chart, Safari, Haji's Kitchen, Brava, Empire, Jig Jigga, and S&S Catering, and the defendants listed under each group represent the 6 indictments. Each indictment charges a group of defendants who work together to defraud the federal child nutrition program with Feeding Our Future as their sponsor. Each of the groups of defendants created entities, typically LLCs, that contracted with Feeding Our Future as a sponsor, and then set up their own food sites that were enrolled in the child nutrition program under Aimee Bock. Some of the groups, such as the Safari and the Empire group, had many food sites claiming to be feeding needy children. Others, such as the Brava group in Rochester, only claimed 1 food site. While some of the details about how these defendants carried out the scheme differed, the basics of the scheme were the same. In addition to the 44 defendants listed on this chart in the 6 indictments, we have charged 3 individuals by information, which means that they are expected to waive their right to a grand jury and are expected to plead guilty and admit their roles in this massive scheme. We have packets of indictments and informations for the press, and they will be posted on our website today. Before I walk through the federal child nutrition program and the details alleged in these indictments, I want to provide an overview of some of the striking facts that we have uncovered in our investigation. First, the defendants obtained over $250 million from the child nutrition program through Feeding Our Future. This money was to be used to feed needy children in Minnesota. Instead, it was used primarily for the benefit of the defendants. And this $250 million is the floor. Our investigation continues. They used this money that was supposed to be used for feeding children to buy houses in Minnesota, resort property and real estate in Kenya and Turkey, luxury cars, commercial property, jewelry, and much more. We have seized property that was purchased with funds from the fraud wherever possible, and we continue to find and seize property these defendants purchased with money from the scheme. The work of locating the property is ongoing. And before I go on, I want to emphasize an additional point that can otherwise get lost in this massive scheme. The money that the defendants took comes from a child nutrition program designed to provide meals to needy children. The funds are to be used to reimburse participants for the food they purchase and the cost of providing meals. The reimbursement rates are modest. No one participating in this scheme legitimately, in this program legitimately, would ever imagine that they could hire staff, purchase food, store the food, handle the logistics involved in this process, make meals, serve them to children, and still make millions of dollars. It's not possible. Even if you are feeding thousands of children, as these defendants claimed, you simply cannot make much money working on this program legitimately. When this program works as it's supposed to, it takes a lot of effort to run it efficiently so that the food gets to children. Here, the defendants primarily pocketed the money for themselves, spending little on food, staff, and logistics. As alleged in the indictments, they didn't have to. They were running a scheme, not a child nutrition program. For a $250 million fraud, the allegations make clear that the defendants worked incredibly fast, stealing money for themselves at a breakneck pace. The plan began when the pandemic started in late March 2020 and spread rapidly. It quickly became the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, as the defendants capitalized on the pandemic and grew this operation within months. And the defendants would have kept going. Their scheme was only shut down when this investigation went public with the unsealing of search warrants in January of 2022. Now, perhaps the most staggering fact of all is the number of fake meals the defendants claim to have served. More than 125 million fake meals are at issue in this case. When multiple sites working with Feeding Our Future claimed 2,000, 3,000, or up to 6,000 meals per day, often 7 days a week, the numbers add up. Again, they did all of this in a little over 20 months. These defendants were executing their scheme fast and in as many locations as they could. Feeding Our Future and these defendants sponsored over 200 sites around Minnesota. The indictments detail a number of these sites, and I'll talk about one or two during these remarks. Different groups of defendants utilize the sites, including sites where they claim to be feeding children, thousands of them, at mobile home parks, small towns, and storefronts. As I said, we have charged today 47 defendants. These are the first set of charges. 3 of these defendants are expected to plead guilty shortly. In addition to Aimee Bock, other Feeding Our Future employees are charged in addition to the defendants who enrolled the false feeding sites, submitted false documentation, and made hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, millions of dollars from this scheme. Finally, as the indictments describe, this was a pay-to-play scheme. The money not only flowed to the defendants operating the fake meal sites, it also flowed back to Feeding Our Future in the form of kickbacks paid to employees in the form of millions of dollars. Feeding Our Future employees assisted on and received millions of dollars in kickbacks for sponsoring the fake feeding sites. While there are many details to the federal child nutrition program, some of which are set forth in the indictments, it is in essence a fairly straightforward program when it works as it's supposed to. The federal funds for this program are provided by the Department of Agriculture and administered by MDE in Minnesota. Approved sponsors work with feeding sites on the paperwork and monitor their sites to make certain that they are complying with the program. The sites buy food, prepare meals, and then certify to the sponsor the number of meals served. Sites are then reimbursed per meal. At times, sites were required to provide rosters of children with their ages to verify that they were complying with the program's requirements. Children were supposed to be between 7 and 17. And they would provide invoices showing that they had purchased food to prepare the meals as claimed. That's how the program was supposed to work. As charged in the indictments, Feeding Our Future sponsored sites solely for the purpose of obtaining money, not to feed needy children. The indictments explain how the defendants set up LLCs overnight to run sites, then immediately entered into contracts with Feeding Our Future, and then announced that they had sites to feed children. The indictments explain how the defendants, one after another, not only set up brand new sites and new entities, they immediately began to claim that they were feeding thousands of children in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and small towns around the state. These defendants claimed that their sites went from 0 to 2,000 children overnight, with little or no planning, staff, food purchases, or logistics. Once they had their applications approved and their contracts with Feeding Our Future set up, the defendants then prepared false reimbursement forms, many of which looked exactly the same. They did this within days or weeks of starting their LLC, getting approved, and finding a site. They then submitted false rosters listing thousands of children who either did not exist or who did not receive meals. These false forms were critical to the success of the scheme. Many reimbursement forms simply listed a number of children and then repeated that number day after day, week after week, month after month. Just the same number of children served according to these false forms. No one got sick, no one missed a meal, no one was away. Same children every single day, every single week. Here's an example of just one of the reimbursement forms that the defendants would submit. This is a form stating that they were serving breakfast. 2,500 breakfast meals to needy children, Sunday, Monday, all the way through Thursday. In this form, the defendants took 2 days off. And you'll see that they served the same number every day, claim to, and that those were the meals prepared and those were the meals served, identical. Day after day, week after week, month after month. At a different site, the defendants claim to be serving supper in an after-school meal program. This one to 3,290 children every day, this one 7 days a week, week after week, month after month. There are countless numbers of these forms, certified at the bottom by one of the defendants involved in the scheme and then sent to Feeding Our Future, who submitted for reimbursement, taking an administrative fee up front and getting kickbacks from many of these sites. Now, not only were the reimbursement forms, as alleged in the indictment, false, the defendants also made up false rosters of children. As the investigation in this matter proceeded, we learned how the defendants would make up names and use different websites to create names. All of the children had to be listed with their age, between 7 and 17. Some of the defendants simply made up names, invented them. Others used a device, a website called listofrandomnames.com. The website is down, but here's what it looked like. It's a website set up to generate a list of random names. It says that it was set up for authors to create character names, parents looking for children's names. You could plug in the number of names you wanted, whether you wanted male, female, or both, just first names, second names, whether you wanted alliteration. It's a website that some of these defendants used rather than making up the names themselves. Because the children had to be between 7 and 17 and they did not exist, the defendants had to invent ages. One of the things that we noticed during the investigation was that ages of children, fake children, month after month, changed. So that a boy in January of 2021 would be 8 years old and then would appear the next month on a spreadsheet as 12 years old. What one of the investigators noticed is that there's an Excel formula built into the spreadsheet that assigns a random name to the ages of the children. That's what caused the changes. So month after month, where some of the children were the same, the fake children were the same, their ages fluctuated wildly, just randomly under this Excel formula. Another example is alleged in the indictments as to why these rosters were false. And then finally, we checked the rosters of the schools where these sites were located to see if these children were enrolled in the schools. Only about 1 or 2% of the names in most of these sites matched the school rosters. These children were simply invented. The indictments also explain that the defendants regularly provided false food invoices, either invoices that were simply made up or invoices that were inflated to show far more food purchased than what the defendants actually bought. Later in the scheme, as alleged in the indictments, the defendants paid to buy fake food invoices to help them cover up the fraud. The indictments also detail the kickback payments made by the defendants who operated the false food sites to Feeding Our Future employees. Feeding Our Future employees would set up their own LLCs to receive these kickbacks, launder them, and hide them from anybody who asked. Different defendants did what they needed to cover up the scheme. In Rochester, for example, when a question came up about the Brava defendants in Rochester and the money that they were receiving, defendant Ayan Jama answered an inquiry by saying that their site was working under a contract with the Rochester Public Schools. And as the indictment alleges, this was false. The defendant was simply trying to deflect any suspicion. Now, most large-scale fraud schemes include assurances and pushback by those running the scheme when suspicions are raised and questions are asked. As set forth in the indictments, Aimee Bock handled most of this. Given the number of sites and the astounding number of meals the defendants claimed to be serving, MDE employees raised questions, suspicions, and concerns with Bock. At times, as set forth in the indictments, Bock would simply lie to MDE that she was monitoring the sites and that Feeding Our Future employees were working at the sites to make sure that the meal counts were accurate. When MDE employees persisted, Bock struck back, accusing them of discriminating against Feeding Our Future sites. Now, despite this, MDE employees continued to push back on Bock, and when MDE refused to accept more Feeding Our Future sites, she launched a lawsuit against MDE, accusing the employees of discriminating against the sites. All of this, the indictment alleges, was simply part of the scheme to cover up the fraud and keep the money flowing to Feeding Our Future and the sites it sponsored. One example of how this worked is contained in literally the opening sentence of the Feeding Our Future lawsuit. A quote from that sentence from the lawsuit of November 2020. Thousands of qualified children in low-income and minority communities are going without desperately needed food because MDE refuses to process Feeding Our Future's applications. It was a powerful allegation and persuasive, but as the indictments allege, it was all a lie. The vast majority of the money for these sites was simply going into the pockets of the defendants, not to feed children. I'm now going to highlight just one of the sites that's listed in the indictment, the Wilmer Site. In the Safari indictment, the charges explain how the defendants set up a site in Wilmer, a small town in Minnesota. Wilmer was just one of the many towns where the defendants claimed to be feeding needy children. The population of the entire town is about 21,000, with 4,500 more or less students enrolled in the school district. Pictured here is the small storefront Fafan restaurant. The indictment alleges that a defendant, Abdi Qadir Mohamud, as was typical in this scheme, created an LLC called Tunyar Trading and entered into an agreement with Feeding Our Future and rented out the small Fafan restaurant in Wilmer. According to the indictment, the defendant paid the owner of Fafan $40,000 a month to rent the restaurant. The defendant quickly claimed to be feeding 2,000 children per week, 7 days a week. But only 33 names on the roster of children he supplied matched names registered at the school district. So according to the indictment, defendant Mohamud claimed to be feeding about 1/2 of all school children in this town, with only 1% of the names matching actual students. Here's an example of one of the meal count reimbursement forms Mohamud submitted. And you'll see that he actually, unlike most of the defendants, varied the number rather than just having the number of people served exactly match the number of meals prepared. But the indictment charges that this site did not serve anywhere near 2,000 children at the Wilmer site. And I want to note also that the Empire Group, a separate set of defendants with their own sites, also opened their own site in Wilmer, claiming to serve needy children. So a quick timeline of how Mohamud created his LLC and operated this scheme. This is an example of how all of these sites, the majority of these sites, operated. On September 28th of 2020, the defendant created Tunyar Trading LLC, brand new LLC. Within days, he and Aimee Bock had reached into an agreement whereby Feeding Our Future would sponsor this site. Bock then immediately submitted an application to MDE to feed thousands of children who needed food in Wilmer. Immediately, Mohamud claimed to be feeding 2,000 children in October of 2020, the same month that he got started. And he leased the Fafan restaurant for $40,000 a month. Now that restaurant, the owner was actually paying $1,600 a month in rent. But Mohamud could offer him a lot more because he knew millions of dollars were coming. In December 2020, the defendant starts Feeding Our Future, the reimbursement forms claiming 2,000 children per day. This is just one example of the many in the indictment about how the defendants carried out this scheme. This fraud, as I said earlier, took place throughout Minnesota, including in Wilmer, in Pelican Rapids, in Waite Park, St. Cloud, Burnsville, Faribault, Mankato, Rochester, Osseo, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and many, many other locations. To date, we have seized approximately $50 million worth of property. 60 bank accounts, 45 parcels of real property, 14 vehicles, jewelry, and other items. The work of locating and seizing this property continues, and we expect that number to grow. In closing, a case like this does not just happen. People work long days and nights over many months to make it possible to bring these charges. And I want to thank the analysts, agents, and forensic accountants of the FBI, IRS, and Postal Inspection Service for their extraordinary work over the course of the past year. They pored over LLC records, bank accounts, communications, reimbursement forms, and rosters of children. I have seen their work in action personally, and it is beyond impressive. And I also want to thank the team of lawyers from the U.S. Attorney's Office who are standing with me today. When MDE employees brought this case to the FBI reached out to Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson. Joe is a veteran white-collar prosecutor and head of our economic crimes section. Joe then built a team of prosecutors who have been working together ever since. And when I say together, they're always together, working. They are Chelsea Walker, Harry Jacobs, Matt Ebert, Craig Bonney, and Joe Tayrab. Our paralegals and litigation specialists worked with an amazing team from the FBI, IRS, and Postal Inspection Service to process a massive amount of data, which made it possible to bring these charges. This team will stay focused on these cases and will continue to the investigation. As I said, these are the first set of charges. I couldn't be more proud of the work of the people on this case. I'm also grateful to Kevin Chambers, the Director of COVID Fraud Enforcement for the Department of Justice, for joining us today from Washington, D.C. Kevin, we appreciate your traveling to Minnesota for this announcement. And finally, I want to highlight the people who have come forward to tell us how this scheme worked. We have gotten cooperation from people who knew about the scheme and others who took part in it. Their help in this investigation has been essential. If you know about this scheme, if you have information concerning this scheme, please contact us. I will now turn this over to Special Agent in Charge, Michael Paul.
Good morning. My name is Michael Paul. I'm the Special Agent in Charge of the FBI's Minneapolis Field Office, which serves Minnesota and North and South Dakota. I want to thank U.S. Attorney Luger and his team for an incredibly supportive set of teamwork in this investigation. And I also want to thank the Minnesota Department of Education for their cooperation and their continued transparency throughout the investigation. This case represents persistence, patience, and dedication, and ultimately the resolve of all the partners you see standing here this morning. As the U.S. Attorney stated, this is the largest COVID fraud case in the nation, and the 18-month joint investigation has been exhaustive, thorough, and intense, and the work continues today. The resulting numbers are absolutely staggering. $250 million, $250 million, defrauded from the United States Department of Agriculture, and ultimately from the taxpayers. The collective investigation and prosecutive team felt strongly early on that we needed to take swift action in order to support Minnesota's state programs and also stop the hemorrhaging of taxpayer funds. When the investigation first became public on January 20th, we had more than 250 law enforcement personnel conducting 25 search warrants across the Twin Cities, all while the temperatures here hovered around 13 below zero. Although the investigation has been complex, the crime is quite simple. It's a massive fraud scheme. And during the investigation, the FBI followed money trail, paper trails, filled with falsified invoices, receipts, and fictitious names. An inconceivable number of meals were allegedly served, all of this representing an astonishing display of deceit and evidence of outright fraud. The investigation specifically demonstrates the prowess of the FBI's forensic accountants, who are adept and tenacious at conducting financial tracing and identifying assets. Their work was critical to this investigation, as you heard, and their work continues. An investigation of this magnitude takes thousands of hours and an incredible amount of allocation of resources from the FBI and from our partner agencies. Over 1,000 bank accounts have been reviewed, over 300 interviews have been conducted, 100 search warrants and 100 seizure warrants have been executed. The FBI and its partners at the United States Postal Inspection Service and the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigative Division conduct routinely complex investigations. These investigations are never rushed to quell public rumors or to address a false narrative. To those who have been charged and arrested today and that have openly and continually claimed that there was no fraud, let me be clear. There's no mistake, there's no misunderstanding, there's no confusion. What is spelled out in the charges details a blatant display of greed. The programs at stake were created to feed children. These individuals were stealing taxpayer funds, taking key support away from state programs. The subjects in this case weren't interested in feeding our future. They were interested in feeding their own gluttony in the way of international vacations, real estate, luxury vehicles, homes, guns, jewelry, and electronics. Whether it's in opposition to financial crimes such as these, violent crimes in our cities, the federal partners are actively working in your communities, in our communities, identifying those who disregard the rule of law and preparing to bring them to justice. Today's actions demonstrate our commitment to ensuring that those who misuse public funds and undermine the public's trust, preying on benefit programs, are held accountable for their actions. Lastly, I want to thank the FBI special agents, our analytical staff, our forensic accountants, the partner personnel from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the IRS's Criminal Investigative Division, and the Assistant United States Attorneys and paralegals here at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. Their work has been tireless, it has been thorough, and every individual that is complicit in this scheme will be held accountable, and because of them, we're able to stand here before you today. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Justin Campbell. I'm the special agent in charge for IRS Criminal Investigation, Chicago Field Office. In that role, I have oversight responsibility for the state of Minnesota as well as several other states. The actions that occurred today are the result of teamwork. It took enormous amount of effort from all the agencies represented, expertise, and ultimately the citizens, taxpayers in Minnesota benefit. IRS Criminal Investigation in particular specializes in financial investigations. Our agents are true masters of their craft. When it comes to complex fraud cases like the one we're here to talk about today, they're really able to showcase their talents. The indictment in this case alleges the defendants took money that was set aside to feed hungry children and instead fed their own greed. They focused on fraud instead of food. For that reason, we are happy to join with our partners to hold them accountable. I want to publicly thank the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service for their partnership on this investigation. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ruth Mendonsa, the inspector in charge of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service Denver Division. In that position, I have oversight of multiple operational teams in Minnesota. We are proud to be standing here with our federal partners, the FBI, IRS, the U.S. Attorney's Office, under the leadership of U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger. The defendants in this case used many means to carry out their fraud scheme. One of those means was the U.S. mail. When the U.S. mail is used for the purpose of committing fraud, it is the job of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service to aggressively investigate that crime. And that is precisely what we did and what we continue to do in this case. As you have heard, in size and in scope, this fraud scheme was massive. There are 47 defendants charged so far. They stole more than $250 million and counting. The fraud scheme was brazen. The defendants stole money that was intended to feed hungry children during a pandemic. They lied, they prepared up their scheme, they papered up their scheme with false documents, in some cases creating children from whole cloth. I am so very proud of the work of the postal inspectors on this investigation. The Postal Inspection Service will continue to work until justice is done. Thank you to our federal partners, the FBI and the IRS. Our partnership makes us stronger, greater than the sum of our parts. And this case has been a model of great partnership. Thank you to these hard-working federal prosecutors from this U.S. Attorney's Office. And thank you to Andy, the U.S. Attorney, for your leadership and abiding commitment to justice. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to start by first thanking you, United States Attorney Luger, for the invitation to join in this important announcement. As you've heard, this is the largest COVID fraud scheme the Justice Department has charged to date. And we are here today due to the hard work and determination of the women and men who have investigated and are now prosecuting this matter, including FBI, IRS Criminal Investigations, and the United States Postal Inspection Service. This is a significant investigation for several reasons. It is significant not only because of the dollars involved, nor only because of the substantial number of defendants, though those are both very important. It is also significant because it represents the very type of fraud that the department has identified as a foremost enforcement priority. 1 week ago, the Justice Department announced the launch of 3 strike force teams around the nation. These strike force teams are focused on what we call large-scale COVID fraud, defined as that involving criminal organizations or illicit enterprises with fraudsters working in concert to take advantage of pandemic relief programs. It also includes fraud perpetrated directly or indirectly by international actors. The conduct alleged in the Feeding Our Futures matter is precisely the type of case that our strike force teams are designed to combat. This case highlights the very real problem of large-scale COVID fraud and underscores why the department is so focused on these cases. As the folks here in Minneapolis will tell you, these are complex investigations. By creating these strike force teams, which are currently working on several active large-scale fraud matters, the department will continue to develop and apply pandemic fraud expertise to cases like Feeding Our Future across the nation. But today, we're here to talk about these indictments in particular, which serve as a clear example of what happens when the Justice Department works with our agency partners to identify those who saw the pandemic as an opportunity for personal gain. The defendants in this scheme are alleged not only to have deceived knowingly the state and federal government to misappropriate funds, they are alleged to have done so by falsely claiming they provided meals to thousands of children in Minnesota, meals those children needed during the pandemic. The funds were then allegedly used to purchase luxury vehicles, for international travel, and to acquire real estate. Funds were also moved overseas to buy property in Kenya and Turkey. The indictments unsealed today shine a light not only on this egregious alleged conduct, but also, and I would say more importantly, on the tremendous efforts of the U.S. Attorney's Office and its law enforcement partners. This case will serve as a model for our strike forces across the country and our U.S. Attorney's offices. On behalf of the Department of Justice, I'd like to thank you for this remarkable work and the work that I know is yet to come.
Okay, it's getting hot up here, but I'm going to start with Scott. If you don't mind, I know most of you, but if you could just say your name and where you're from for the benefit of everybody, that would be great. Scott?
Thank you. My name is Scott Johnson. I write for the Site Power Line. Mr. Luger, you described a fraud that was massive and also, to borrow a term, open and obvious. Can you explain to the average person how this went on for almost 2 years without being shut down?
Well, I'm going to stick with what's in the indictment for all of your questions, including Scott's. The indictment alleges that there were concerns raised very early on by employees of MDE. They got pushed back, they got accused of discrimination, and ultimately they got sued. That's what the indictment says. When MDE employees got sued, fought the lawsuit, they ultimately brought this to the FBI. It took the FBI in our office until January 2022 to be able to shut this down, but with people working at breakneck speed. But everything about that is in the indictments. That's what I have to limit my comments to. Thank you for the question, Scott. Joey.
Yes, Joey Peters with Sahan Journal. Just curious if partners in quality care is fraud, the same contract with organization called Ruth. This is fast.
So the indictments, which you'll have a chance to read, and they're long, only name feeding our future, so that's all I'm going to say today. Yeah, Matt. Yes.
Is anybody being held in jail now other than the 2 defendants who were charged in the past court?
Yeah, arrests were made this morning, and some defendants were arrested, and they'll have their initial appearance today, and then the magistrates will decide whether people are detained or not. Yes.
Are you able to say, did MDE do anything wrong?
Yeah, that's not for me to say. We're pleased with the cooperation, thorough cooperation we got from MDE throughout this investigation. But whenever there's a large-scale fraud, everybody starts talking to about who's to blame. In my job and in my role, I blame the defendants who perpetrated, covered up, and executed the scheme. Yes.
Ken Delaney from NBC News.
Yes, Ken.
Can you talk about the impact of this fraud and who it hurt? Did children go hungry as a result of this?
So the indictments don't go into that. What's public knowledge is that a lot of these school districts actually were continuing to serve meals during this fraud, and so these sites were not necessary, but that's what I'm going to limit my answer to because the indictments don't go further into that. Thanks for the question. Yes.
Jonah Kaplan from WCCO. You talk about this as a COVID fraud case. There were a lot of pots of money for COVID relief.
Right.
What was the pot of, where did this money come from? Sure. And is this related to PPP? Is it related to any of the COVID relief packages? Where in the trillions of dollars
Sure.
did this come from?
This came from a child nutrition program, federal child nutrition program, 2 of them actually, that are run out of the Department of Agriculture and administered by states around the country. So it's a pandemic fraud because the defendants used the existence of the pandemic to both carry out and cover up their fraud. It's not a PPE or PPL fraud.
Okay. Can you speak, you talk about the work is ongoing. People are going to look at this and think it's related to that. Are you still looking for fraud in those big pots of money?
This investigation is focused on this scheme, which extends beyond these defendants. Amy.
This is Aimee Bock from AP. Did the indictment say who orchestrated it, who came up with the idea? Was it Aimee Bock?
The indictments don't list a ringleader. They talk about how the vast majority of these sites were sponsored by Feeding Our Future and Aimee Bock. Yeah.
Dave Farenthold from the New York Times. There were 2 sort of prominent local officials who resigned their positions earlier this year, Sharmarki Issa and Abiner Sala, that were sort of caught up in this and mentioned in the search warrants. Are they among those indicted?
Yes. That was a short question. Amy, you don't get a second question yet.
Can I get a second one?
Not you, Matt. Somebody else? In the back, yes.
Dean Winter with the Minnesota
Hi.
There's a Justice Department policy that kind of tries to stay away from charges before elections. Did you have to take that into consideration, and how high did those conversations go to decide to go forward with these?
Yeah, this case is not about elections. This is about fraud. Yes. Thanks, Dina. Wait. Before you ask a second question.
Ravels and Fox 9, does this alleged fraud go beyond Minnesota? What if 50 states? I can imagine this investigation is broad.
Our investigation focuses on what happened in Minnesota.
Are there other investigations in other states?
Well, I'll let Kevin talk about it. You want to address that, Kevin? I'm only the U.S. Attorney for Minnesota.
Not only. As you might imagine, while this scheme is complex, there's nothing unique or special about Minnesota, which means that it could only occur here. Now, the Justice Department does not comment on ongoing non-public cases, but I can tell you that the creation of the task forces that we've set up is specifically to address and combat the type of fraud that we're seeing here in Minnesota.
All right, a couple more. Yes.
How many of these suspects are currently in custody or believed to be turning themselves in? Are any at large, and are any believed to have fled the country?
Some of the defendants are not in the country at this time. We'll have more information on that for you. The rest are going through processing right now, and many will have their initial appearances. They're surrendering, and some have been arrested.
How many are not in the country?
See, you're going to ask that no matter what. All right. I'll get an answer to you. I'll get an exact answer to you later.
Mr. Luger,
Yes.
were there any cooperating witnesses among the people who were doing the fraud who ended up helping the FBI with the investigation?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Can you talk about why you chose to unseal the search warrants back in January, or move to have them unsealed?
Back in January, I was waiting to become the United States Attorney. I wasn't here, so I can't comment. No. Yes. Wait. All right, you go ahead, and then behind you. Yeah.
Why this was allowed to go on for so long? Can we read anything in the fact that the Agriculture Department Inspector General is not represented up here?
No.
Isn't there a failure of basic oversight?
I have no information on that. I'm sorry. Yes.
There have been over a dozen other cases of fraud involving the meals program in other states when people convicted of crimes related to that. Is this the largest fraud ever perpetrated on the meals program?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm told the answer is yes. Okay.
Are there recommendations to the Department of Agriculture or to Minnesota about how to prevent this in the future?
Sure.
What are the takeaways? Does there need to be better checks and balances on these forms, on these children, better applications?
It's a great question. My job is to prosecute fraud. Nobody asks me for my recommendations on issues of how to do their programs. That's for a lot of other people to decide. Wait, Dina, in the back.
Curious question. You said it's the largest fraud, what, in the
Oh, involving a food program. Yes. All right, one more, and then before everybody withers up here, we're gonna call this.
How many of these sites were serving some meals?
Sure.
Versus how many were just completely factory?
So, good question. The indictments allege that it doesn't specify to that degree. The indictments allege that in some of the sites, food was purchased, some people were offered meals. But recognize, this is not just a free meal program. This is a child nutrition program for children 7 to 17. So there were sites that offered some meals. The indictments allege it was part of the cover-up to make it look like they were complying. But the indictments also make it clear that the rosters of children and the reimbursement forms were false, and that was integral to the scheme. Thank you, everybody.
One numbers question. You're alleging 250 million in fraud. That's virtually every dollar that Feeding Our Future ever collected. Are you saying that all the money that Feeding Our Future collected was fraudulent?
It's in the indictments. I'm going to refer to the indictments to answer that question.
Was Aimee Bock one of the ones that was arrested today?
Folks, we'll have copies of the charging documents here in the back, if you'd like. And if you have any other follow-up questions, please email Tasha, and we will get back.